The billionaire's assistant screamed his name across the ballroom, and Nathan Brooks didn't even turn around. Every camera in the room swung toward him. A man who ignored the richest woman in America in front of 500 witnesses. Nobody knew that 30 seconds later, Victoria Sterling would ask him a question that would end her marriage to power and start the only real relationship of her life. If you're watching this from a city where it's already dark outside, drop it in the comments. I want to know how far this story has traveled tonight. And if stories like this move, you hit subscribe because this one is going to wreck you in the best way. Now let's go back to the beginning. The ballroom at the Whitmore Hotel smelled like money. Not perfume, not champagne money. The specific scent of a $1,000 candle burning next to fresh-cut orchids flown in from somewhere that didn't matter because nobody in that room had ever asked where flowers came from. Victoria Sterling stood near the center of it in a black dress that cost more than most people's cars, and she was drowning. Not literally. Nobody drowns in a room full of people who want to shake your hand. But that's exactly what it felt like. Hands everywhere reaching for her like she was a rope thrown into water, except she was the one who needed saving, and nobody seemed to notice. Victoria. You look radiant. A senator's wife air-kissing both cheeks without touching skin. Ms. Sterling, if I could just get 30 seconds of your time regarding the Peterson account. A man in a tuxedo, 2 sizes too tight, sweating through his cufflinks. Victoria darling, we simply must discuss the gala committee for next spring. A woman whose name Victoria couldn't remember, though she'd apparently known her for 11 years. Victoria smiled. She always smiled. It was a muscle she'd trained so well, it no longer felt like a lie, even though it was. She nodded. She promised callbacks she'd never make. She let her hand be squeezed by men who wanted contracts, and women who wanted invitations. And the whole time, some small, tired part of her stood outside her own body and watched the performance with a kind of exhausted contempt. 41 years old. Net worth somewhere north of $6 billion. Though she'd stopped checking the exact number 2 years ago because it had stopped meaning anything. CEO of Sterling Logistics, one of the largest freight and shipping conglomerates in the country. A woman who could buy this hotel, this ballroom, and every person currently smiling at her, and still go home tonight to an empty house with 14 rooms and not one voice waiting to say her name. She excused herself from the senator's wife with a practiced laugh and drifted toward the edge of the room near the tall windows that looked out over the city lights, and that's when she saw him. He wasn't hard to notice, not because he stood out in any loud way, but because of exactly the opposite. Every other man in that room was working the space, angling his body toward power tracking, who was talking to whom, calculating. This man sat alone at a small round table near the back, in a suit that fit fine, but wasn't tailored, and he wasn't looking at anyone. He was looking down at his phone, and there was something on his face Victoria hadn't seen in this room in years. He was smiling, really smiling, not the performance smile, not the "I'm listening to your pitch" smile. A real one, soft at the corners, private, like whatever he was looking at was the only good thing in the entire building. Victoria found herself walking toward him before she'd decided to. "Excuse me," said a voice attached to a hand on her elbow. Marcus Webb, one of her board members, already talking before she'd stopped moving. "Victoria, I wanted to introduce you to..." "In a minute, Marcus. It'll only take..." "In a minute." She kept walking. She didn't fully understand why. Later, she would tell herself it was curiosity, or boredom, or the particular restlessness of a woman who had bought everything money could buy and found the shelves increasingly empty. But in the moment, it was simpler than that. She just wanted to know what was on that phone screen. She reached his table. He didn't look up. "That must be a good joke," she said. Nathan Brooks glanced up, and for one full second, his face showed absolutely nothing. No recognition. No scramble to stand. No widening eyes. No fumble for words. He looked at her the way a person looks at a stranger who has said something at a bus stop, polite, mildly curious, ready to be friendly, and then move on. "It's not a joke," he said. He turned the phone slightly so she could see. A photo of a little girl, maybe 7 or 8, missing one front tooth, holding up a crayon drawing of what appeared to be a dinosaur wearing a birthday hat. My daughter. She drew this for me this morning before I dropped her at school. She told me it was a stegosaurus, but I'm pretty sure she meant triceratops. I didn't have the heart to tell her. Victoria almost laughed. Not the polished laugh she gave at these things, an actual surprised sound came out of her. May I? She gestured at the empty chair. Sure, Nathan said, and went back to looking at the drawing. She sat. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and the silence was the strangest thing that had happened to Victoria in months. Nobody let silence exist around her. Silence was a vacuum that people in her orbit rushed to fill with pitches and flattery. This man just sat there content, like he had somewhere better to be, but wasn't in a hurry to get there. You know who I am, Victoria said. It wasn't quite a question. I do. He slid the phone into his jacket pocket. You're Victoria Sterling. Your company's logo is on half the trucks on I-95. My brother-in-law drives for one of your regional contractors, actually. Says the pay's decent, benefits are better than most. That's it. Nathan tilted his head. What else is there? Most people, when they find out... She stopped herself, aware of how it sounded. Most people want something, or they want me to know how impressed they are. You haven't asked me for anything. You haven't told me how incredible it is to meet me. You've shown me a stegosaurus drawing. Triceratops, Nathan corrected with the ghost of a smile. Allegedly. You're the only person in this room who hasn't tried to impress me, Victoria said, and she heard the honesty in her own voice, raw in a way she hadn't allowed herself in a long time. Nathan considered that for a second. I didn't come here to impress anybody. My company bought a table. I got the seat nobody else wanted because I don't golf and I hate small talk. I'm mostly counting the minutes until I can go home and make sure my daughter's asleep and not still up reading with a flashlight under the blanket, which she thinks I don't know about. You have somewhere better to be than here, Victoria said. Something in her chest tightened when she said it, though she couldn't have said why. I always have somewhere better to be than here, Nathan said without any edge to it, like it was simply a fact of the world, the sky being blue. I already have everything that matters. This. He nodded at the ballroom, the chandelier, the string quartet in the corner playing something classical and forgettable. This is just Tuesday, a very expensive Tuesday. Victoria sat with that for a long moment. Around them, the party kept moving, laughter in clusters, waiters gliding through with trays, the low roar of several hundred people simultaneously trying to be noticed. None of it touched their table. It was like they'd stepped half an inch sideways out of the room without leaving their chairs. Can I ask you something? Victoria said finally. You can ask. What makes someone like you look happier than someone like me? She hadn't planned to say it. It came out of some place underneath her calculation, underneath the boardroom voice and the acquisition strategy, and the 20 years of learning never to show a weakness in a room full of competitors. It came out like a confession. Nathan didn't answer right away. He looked at her. Really looked the way people used to look at each other, before everyone's attention got auctioned off to screens and status, and the next transaction, and something in his expression softened, like he understood he'd just been handed something fragile and needed to be careful with it. I don't think it's a fair question, he said slowly. Because I don't know your life. I don't know what you've built or what it cost you. But if you're asking why I'm sitting here smiling at a drawing of a dinosaur, instead of working this room like everybody else. He paused. It's because nobody's waiting for those people to come home. Nobody's up past bedtime hoping to hear the garage door. I've got someone waiting for me. That's not something you can buy. It's just something you either have or you don't. Victoria felt that land somewhere behind her sternum, a physical sensation, like a hand pressing flat against her chest. I have a house with 14 rooms. She said quietly. Nobody's waiting in any of them. Nathan didn't say anything right away. He didn't reach for her hand, didn't offer some smooth line about how a woman like her didn't need anyone waiting, didn't try to fix it or flatter her out of it. He just let it sit there, honored it with silence, and after a moment he said, "That sounds lonely." "It is," Victoria said, and it was the first time in longer than she could remember that she'd said something true out loud to a person who wasn't on her payroll. Marcus Webb appeared at her shoulder again, this time with two other men in tow. All three of them wearing the specific expression of people who had been waiting for their turn and had run out of patience. "Victoria, I really do need 5 minutes." Marcus said, an edge creeping into his voice now. "The Hendricks people are only in town tonight." Victoria looked at him, then back at Nathan, who had already picked up his water glass, already settling back into the posture of a man who expected the conversation to end no hard feelings because he hadn't needed anything from it in the first place. "What's your name?" she asked him before she stood. "Nathan Brooks." "Nathan Brooks," she repeated like she was filing it away somewhere important. "Thank you for the conversation. Thank you for asking a real question," Nathan said. "Most people don't." She stood, smoothed her dress, and let Marcus lead her away toward the Hendricks people, and she didn't look back, because looking back would have meant admitting that some part of her wanted to stay at that small round table in the back of the room, talking to a man who didn't want anything from her for the rest of the night. Nathan Brooks left the gala at 9:40 p.m., which was earlier than he was supposed to, but nobody from the office noticed, and he didn't ask permission. He drove home in his 7-year-old Honda Civic with a check engine light that had been on for 3 months and a crack in the windshield from a rock on the interstate that he kept meaning to get fixed through streets that got progressively less impressive the farther he got from downtown, until he pulled into the driveway of a small 2-story house with a basketball hoop over the garage that hadn't had a net in over a year. Mrs. Alvarez, his neighbor, was on her porch with a cup of tea when he got out of the car. "How was the fancy party?" she called over. "Boring," Nathan said, and meant it mostly. "Lily give you any trouble?" "That child never gives anyone trouble. She had 1.5 glasses of milk and told me a very long story about a girl at school named Madison, who apparently cannot be trusted." Nathan smiled. "Yeah, Madison's had a rough month according to Lily's reporting." He paid Mrs. Alvarez for the sitting. She waved him off twice before finally taking the money, the same ritual they went through every time, and let himself into the quiet house. The living room was the same as it always was, a couch with a blanket permanently draped over the back, a bookshelf crowded with more of Lily's chapter books than his own, a photo on the side table of a woman with dark hair and a wide laugh, next to a much smaller Lily, maybe 4 years old at the time, both of them squinting into the sun. He looked at that photo every night. He didn't need to. He had it memorized down to the exact tilt of her head, the exact place the light caught her hair. But he looked anyway, the way you touch a bruise to make sure it still hurts, to make sure you haven't gone numb to the thing that matters most. "Hey, Kate," he said quietly, the way he always did. "You wouldn't believe the party I just got dragged to." He climbed the stairs and opened Lily's door an inch. She was asleep or close to it, one arm flung over the edge of the bed, a book splayed open on the pillow beside her, not hidden under the blanket tonight, which meant she must have actually meant to go to sleep, and lost the battle with her own eyelids partway through. He moved the book to the nightstand, careful not to lose her page, and pulled the blanket up over her shoulder. "Daddy?" Her voice was thick with almost sleep. "Hey, Bug, go back to sleep." "Did you have fun at the party?" Nathan sat on the edge of her bed. "I met someone interesting." "Who?" "A lady. She asked me a hard question." Lily's eyes opened halfway, curious despite the hour. "What question?" "She asked me why I looked happy." Lily considered this with the total seriousness only an 8-year-old can bring to a nonsensical question. "That's a weird question. You're happy because it's Tuesday and Tuesdays are pizza night, and also because I'm here." Nathan laughed quiet so it wouldn't wake her further. "Yeah, that's pretty much what I told her." "Is she nice?" He thought about it, the black dress, the tired eyes underneath the practiced smile, the honesty that had cracked through when she said, "Nobody's waiting in any of them." "I think she's lonely," he said. "I think she's the loneliest person I've ever met, and she doesn't know how to fix it." "That's sad," Lily said, already drifting again. "Yeah, Bug, it is." He sat there another minute after her breathing evened out, then went downstairs. poured himself 2 fingers of the whiskey he kept for nights like this. Not many nights, just the ones where the weight of doing everything alone pressed a little harder than usual, and sat on the couch in the dark, thinking about a woman he'd probably never see again. He didn't think much would come of it. Rich people met interesting strangers at parties all the time. It was probably a 5-minute curiosity for her already fading by the time her car pulled up to whatever mansion she went home to. He finished his drink, rinsed the glass, and went to bed. And if you'd told him that night that his phone would ring 3 days later with a number he didn't recognize, and that the voice on the other end would change the rest of his life, he would have laughed and told you that you didn't understand people like Victoria Sterling. He would have been wrong. Victoria didn't sleep that night. She sat in her home office at 1 a.m., the kind of hour where the whole house feels like it's holding its breath, staring at her phone with Nathan's name typed into a contact field she'd created after getting his number from the event planner, who'd gotten it from the insurance company's HR department, who'd been more than a little confused about why Victoria Sterling's office was requesting the contact information of a mid-level claims administrator. She didn't call. Calling felt like it would collapse something delicate, expose the whole thing as strange and inappropriate, a billionaire tracking down a stranger's phone number after one conversation at a party. What would she even say? "Hi, this is Victoria. You don't know me well. You do know me. Everyone knows me. But you're the only one who didn't seem to care. And I've been thinking about what you said for 6 hours and I can't stop." She put the phone down, picked it up again, put it down. Her assistant Diane found her there at 7 the next morning, still in yesterday's clothes, staring at a blank document on her laptop that was supposed to be notes for the Hendricks negotiation. "You didn't sleep," Diane said, not really a question. She'd worked for Victoria for 11 years. She knew the signs. "I'm fine. You have the board call at 9. The one where Richard's going to push the layoffs in the Ohio distribution centers again." Victoria rubbed her eyes. "I know. Can I ask what's going on?" "You've had that look since the gala," Victoria almost told her. Almost. But some part of her wasn't ready to say it out loud yet, wasn't ready to hear how it would sound. "I met a man who doesn't want anything from me, and I can't stop thinking about it, because saying it out loud would make it real, and if it was real, she'd have to decide what to do about it." And Victoria Sterling had spent 20 years being decisive about everything except her own heart. "I'm fine," she said again. "Get me coffee, a lot of it." She got through the board call. She fought Richard Callahan to a stalemate on the Ohio layoffs, which was its own kind of victory, since Richard rarely lost anything without a fight and a grudge. She sat through 4 more meetings, signed off on a shipping contract renewal, reviewed quarterly projections that all pointed in directions that used to excite her and now just felt like numbers on a screen. At 6:15 p.m., alone in her office, everyone else gone home, she picked up her phone and called Nathan Brooks before she could talk herself out of it again. It rang twice. "Hello?" His voice cautious, the voice of a man who didn't recognize the number and was bracing for a telemarketer. "Nathan, it's Victoria Sterling." A pause on the other end, long enough that she started composing an apology in her head, already regretting the call, already planning how she'd laugh it off as impulsive nonsense. "Well," Nathan said finally, and she could hear something in his voice. Not annoyance, something closer to amusement. "I have to say, I didn't expect this to become a callback situation. I'm sorry, is this strange? I can hang up." "It's a little strange," Nathan admitted. "I'm currently elbow deep in dishwater because my daughter decided tonight was the night to make a science experiment out of baking soda and food coloring. And now, half my kitchen looks like a crime scene from a very colorful murder. So the timing's a little strange too. But no, don't hang up." Victoria laughed, and it surprised her again, the ease of it. A crime scene. Blue and red, very dramatic. She's very proud of it. I'm less proud of the counter. "Do you need to go clean it?" "It'll keep. Lily's currently distracted trying to convince the counter to forgive her, which is a whole separate conversation I'm not equipped to have on 4 hours of sleep." He shifted something on his end. She heard a chair scrape, the sound of him sitting down, settling in. "What's this about Victoria?" Nobody called her Victoria like that anymore. Not Ms. Sterling, not with the careful deference everyone used, but just Victoria flat and unimpressed the way you'd address a neighbor. "I don't entirely know," she said honestly. "I keep thinking about what you said, about someone waiting for you to come home. I haven't stopped thinking about it actually, and I don't know what to do with that, so I suppose I called to tell you that which, now that I'm saying it out loud, sounds fairly ridiculous." "It's not ridiculous," Nathan said, and his voice had gone gentler. "It's honest. There's a difference. You keep doing that." "Doing what?" "Saying the thing that makes me feel less crazy for saying the thing I said." Nathan was quiet for a second. "For what it's worth, I've thought about it too. Our conversation, not—" He stopped, seemed to reconsider his words. "Not in a strange way. Just it's not every day someone asks you a question like that and actually wants the real answer instead of the polite one. I wanted the real answer. I could tell. That's why I gave it to you." Somewhere in the background on his end, a small voice yelled something about the food coloring reaching the ceiling, and Nathan let out a groan that turned into a laugh. "I have to go. Apparently we've achieved liftoff." "Go," Victoria said, smiling in a way that felt unfamiliar on her own face, like a muscle stretching after years of disuse. "Go save your kitchen, Victoria." He said her name again before hanging up, and something about the way he said it made her chest tighten. "Thank you for calling. I mean that." "Good night, Nathan." She sat in her office for a long time after the call ended, the city lights spread out below her window. The phone still warm in her hand, and for the first time in longer than she wanted to admit, Victoria Sterling didn't feel like the loneliest person in a 14-room house. She felt for a few minutes like a woman who had just had an actual conversation with an actual person, and it terrified her exactly as much as it thrilled her. The calls became a habit neither of them named out loud. Not every night Nathan's life didn't allow for that kind of consistency, not with Lily's homework and swim practice, and the particular chaos of raising a child alone, and Victoria's calendar was a battlefield of board meetings and international calls and crises that required her personal attention at every hour. But 2 or 3 times a week, usually after Lily was in bed, usually after Victoria had finished the last of her evening obligations, the phone would ring and they would talk. They talked about nothing important mostly. That was what struck Victoria most, how much of it was nothing. Nathan told her about Lily's ongoing feud with a girl named Madison over the swing set at recess, a diplomatic crisis he treated with the gravity of a UN summit, because Lily needed him to. He told her about his late wife Kate, in small pieces at first, how they'd met in college, how she'd made him laugh so hard once at a movie theater that they'd gotten kicked out, how the ovarian cancer had come fast, 18 months from diagnosis to the funeral, how he still sometimes reached for his phone to text her something funny before he remembered. Victoria told him things she hadn't told anyone. About her father who'd built Sterling Logistics from 3 trucks and a warehouse, and had taught her that weakness was the only unforgivable sin, that crying in front of employees was a resignation letter, that love was something you scheduled around, not something you built a life on. About her marriage in her 20s, brief and cold, and mostly transactional ending in a settlement, neither of them contested because neither of them had ever really wanted the other person, just the appearance of the thing. About the particular loneliness of being surrounded by people every single day, and never once, not for one single hour, feeling truly seen. "Nobody's ever asked me what I actually want," she told him one night nearly 11 weeks after the gala, curled into the corner of her enormous empty couch with the television off and just her voice and his voice filling the silence. "Everyone assumes they know. More money, more power, a bigger legacy. Nobody's ever just asked." "What do you actually want?" Nathan asked. Victoria was quiet for a long moment. "I want someone to notice if I don't come home. I'd notice," Nathan said so simply, so without hesitation, that it knocked something loose in her chest. "You would—" "Victoria, you call me 3 times a week now. If you stopped, I'd notice by Wednesday." She laughed, but it came out wet, and she realized with some embarrassment that she was crying quietly in her dark living room, over a sentence a man had said to her on the phone. "Are you crying?" Nathan asked, gentle, no judgment in it. "A little." "Good ones or bad ones?" "I don't know," she admitted. "I don't think I've cried in front of anyone, or well near anyone, in probably 10 years. I didn't know I still could." "You can," Nathan said. "Turns out, it's like riding a bike." She laughed again, for real this time, through the tears, and something about that laughing and crying in the same breath, being fully messily human on the phone, with a man who didn't want a single thing from her, felt like the first real thing she'd experienced in a decade. They didn't call it anything those weeks. Not a relationship, not a courtship. Victoria was too aware of the 17 ways it could go wrong. Too aware of the tabloid appetite that would descend on anything resembling a story involving her name. And Nathan was too protective of Lily, too careful with the fragile ecosystem he'd built for his daughter after losing her mother to rush toward anything that might blow it apart. They were for those weeks simply two people who talked, who'd found against every reasonable expectation that they understood each other in a way neither of them had understood anyone else in years. It was Lily who noticed first in the unguarded way children notice things adults try to hide. "You've been smiling at your phone a lot," she told her father one evening, perched on the kitchen counter while he made dinner, swinging her legs. "Is it the lonely lady?" Nathan nearly dropped the spoon he was holding. "What makes you say that? You get a different smile, not your regular smile, a softer one." Lily said this with the matter-of-fact confidence of an 8-year-old who considered herself an expert on her father's emotional states. "Is she still lonely?" Nathan considered his answer carefully, the way he considered most things Lily asked, because she deserved honesty, even when honesty was complicated. "I think she's a little less lonely than she used to be. Because of you. Maybe a little." "Is that why you smile at your phone?" "Maybe a little of that too," Nathan admitted. Lily nodded, satisfied, like she'd confirmed a hypothesis. "Can I meet her sometime?" The question sat at the kitchen like a held breath. It was the first time either of them, Nathan or Lily, had spoken the possibility of Victoria stepping fully into their world, not as a voice on the phone, but as a person at their kitchen table, and Nathan felt the full weight of what that would mean. Lily had already lost one parent. Every person he let close to her was a risk he calculated with the precision of a man diffusing something that could not be allowed to detonate. "Maybe someday," he said carefully. "Let's see how things go." Lily accepted this with the easy patience of a child who trusted her father's judgment completely, and went back to swinging her legs and asking if dinner was almost ready, and Nathan stood at the stove thinking that "someday" had just become a much heavier word than it used to be. Victoria's world, meanwhile, was quietly beginning to notice too. Diane clocked it first, the way Victoria's evening calendar had started clearing earlier, the way she'd started leaving the office by 7 instead of 9. The particular lightness that had crept into her voice on certain nights when Diane happened to still be in the outer office and heard Victoria laughing, actually laughing behind her closed door. "You're seeing someone," Diane said one morning, setting down the coffee with the confidence of a woman who'd earned the right to pry. "I'm not seeing anyone," Victoria said too quickly. "Victoria, I've worked for you for 11 years. I know what you look like when you're closing a deal you're excited about, and I know what you look like when you're worried about a board vote, and I have never, not once in 11 years, seen you look like this, like this. So, who is he?" Victoria set down her pen. There was no point pretending with Diane. Diane had seen her through 2 divorces worth of emotional wreckage and one very ugly hostile takeover attempt, and had never once betrayed a confidence. "His name is Nathan," she said. "I met him at the Children's Hospital Gala. He works in insurance claims. He's a widower. He has a daughter." Diane's eyebrows climbed. "That's about as far from your usual type as a person can get." "He doesn't want anything from me," Victoria said, and there was something almost defensive in it, like she was preparing herself for the argument she assumed was coming. "That's the thing, Diane. He's never once asked me for a single thing. Not money, not a job, not an introduction, nothing. He just talks to me. Like I'm a person." "You are a person," Diane said gently. "I know that. I just haven't felt like one in a very long time." Diane studied her for a moment, the same look she'd give a contract clause she wanted to make sure she fully understood before signing off on it. "Does he make you happy?" Victoria thought about the sound of Lily's voice yelling about food coloring in the background of their calls, about Nathan's laugh about the particular safety of being fully known by someone who had absolutely nothing to gain from knowing her. "Yes," she said, and it was the simplest, truest thing she'd said in her office in years. "Then be careful," Diane said not unkindly. "Not because of him, because of everyone else. You know what happens when the world finds out Victoria Sterling has a soft spot. They'll come for it. All of them. Richard Callahan's been looking for a weakness for 3 years, and this—" She gestured vaguely, meaning the lightness in Victoria's face, the calendar clearing early, the whole shape of whatever was growing. This is exactly the kind of thing he'd use. Victoria felt a chill move through her, quick and cold, and for a moment the warmth of the last 11 weeks contracted into something smaller and more fragile than it had felt a moment before. "Nobody knows," she said. "We've been careful." "You've been careful in a city full of photographers who make a living selling exactly this kind of story," Diane said. "Careful only lasts until it doesn't." Victoria didn't answer. She looked out the window at the skyline, the same skyline she'd looked at 1,000 times, and thought about Nathan sitting at his kitchen table with dish soap on his hands and his daughter's chaos filling the background of his voice, and she thought with a certainty that surprised her that whatever came next, whatever it cost her, she wasn't ready to give that up. Not yet. Maybe not ever. She didn't know sitting there that Diane's warning would prove prophetic within the month. She didn't know that a photographer with a long lens and a freelance tip about the reclusive Sterling heiress spending suspicious late nights outside a modest house in the suburbs was already parked half a block from Nathan's driveway, waiting for exactly the kind of photograph that would end the quiet, careful world they'd built in 11 weeks of phone calls and stolen honesty. She only knew that for the first time since she could remember, she had something worth protecting that had nothing to do with a balance sheet, and the thought of losing it frightened her more than any hostile takeover, any board vote, any crisis her company had ever handed her. That night, she called Nathan as usual, and he answered on the second ring, his voice warm, unguarded, glad to hear from her, and for one more evening, the world outside their conversation didn't exist at all. 12 weeks after the gala, Victoria Sterling found herself doing something she hadn't done in over a decade. She canceled a meeting for no reason except that she didn't want to go. It was a Tuesday. Richard Callahan had scheduled an informal lunch to discuss restructuring opportunities in the Midwest Division, which Victoria had learned over the years was corporate language for cutting jobs and calling it efficiency. She sat at her desk at 11:40, staring at the meeting invite, and instead of walking to the elevator, she picked up her phone and texted Diane, "Reschedule Callahan. Tell him something came up." Something had come up. Lily had a piano recital that afternoon, and Nathan had mentioned it 3 days earlier, almost in passing. The way he mentioned most things about his daughter. Not as an invitation, exactly, just as a fact of his life that he was sharing with her, because that was what they did. Now they shared facts of their lives with each other. "She's been practicing the same 8 bars of Fur Elise for 2 weeks, he'd told her on the phone. "I've heard it so many times I dream about it. Not even the good dream kind. The kind where you're trapped in an elevator, and it's the elevator music." "When is it?" "Tuesday, 3 o'clock. Nothing fancy, just the school gymnasium and a bunch of parents pretending the sound system doesn't make everything sound like it's being played underwater." Victoria hadn't said anything else about it in the moment, but she'd written it down, actually written it down, 3 o'clock Tuesday. On a sticky note she pressed to the corner of her monitor, something she hadn't done since her assistant days decades ago, when she used to write down things that mattered because she was afraid of forgetting them. She arrived at the elementary school gymnasium at 2:50, alone in a blazer and jeans, instead of anything that would draw eyes. Her hair pulled back. Sunglasses she took off the moment she stepped inside, because wearing them indoors would have drawn more attention than not wearing them at all. She found a seat in the back row of folding chairs between a grandmother with a video camera the size of a toaster and a father who was clearly checking his work email under the guise of watching the program. Nathan spotted her almost immediately. She watched something move across his face, surprise first, and then something warmer that he tried not very successfully to keep off his features. He didn't come over. Not right away. He gave her a small nod, the kind you'd give an acquaintance careful, and she understood why there were other parents here, people who might recognize her, people whose curiosity could turn into a phone call to a reporter faster than either of them wanted to think about. But when Lily walked up to the small electric keyboard set up at the front of the gym hair in two crooked braids that had clearly been done by a father who tried very hard, Nathan turned in his seat and found Victoria's eyes across the room, and the look on his face said everything his silence couldn't. "You came," Victoria mouthed back without sound. "Of course I came." Lily played for Elise. She missed a note in the fourth measure recovered, missed another one, 2 bars later, and finished with a flourish that was more confidence than accuracy. And the gymnasium erupted in the specific, over-enthusiastic applause reserved for children's recitals. The kind of applause that makes up in volume what the performance may have lacked in polish. Victoria found herself clapping harder than anyone around her, something swelling in her chest that she didn't have an easy name for. After the program ended, parents mingled near the refreshment table, a folding table with a plastic tablecloth and a sheet cake that said, "Great job." Musicians in blue icing, and Victoria hung back near the door, unsure whether approaching Nathan and Lily together in public was a line either of them was ready to cross. Nathan made the decision for her. He crossed the gym with Lily's hand in his, weaving between clusters of parents, and stopped in front of Victoria with an expression that was equal parts nervous and hopeful. "Lily," he said, crouching slightly to her height. "This is my friend Victoria. She came to hear you play." Lily studied Victoria with the frank, unfiltered assessment only children are capable of. "Are you the lonely lady?" Victoria's breath caught. She glanced at Nathan, who had gone slightly pink, clearly not having anticipated his daughter would lead with that particular piece of information. "Lily," he started. "It's all right," Victoria said, crouching down to Lily's level the way she hadn't crouched down to talk to anyone in years, some old muscle memory surfacing from a childhood she rarely let herself think about. "I used to be a little lonely, yes. Your dad's been very good company, though. He talks about you all the time. Good things. Only good things. He told me about your dinosaur drawing. He says it was a triceratops, but he wasn't totally sure." Lily's face lit up with the particular delight of a child whose art has been discussed by an adult stranger with apparent seriousness. "It was a triceratops. Daddy just doesn't know his dinosaurs." "I stand corrected," Nathan said, straightening up, and the look he gave Victoria over his daughter's head was so full of something unguarded and grateful that Victoria had to look away for a second, back down at Lily, just to keep her composure. "You played beautifully," Victoria told her. "I clapped the loudest. Ask anyone." "You did," Nathan confirmed. "I heard you. You clap like you're trying to put out a fire." Victoria laughed, and Lily laughed too, mostly because the adults were laughing, and for one unguarded minute, in a school gymnasium that smelled like sheet cake and floor wax, the three of them stood together like something that made sense, like a shape that had been missing a piece and had, just without anyone quite planning it, found it. It didn't last, of course. Nothing that good ever lasts uninterrupted. A woman Victoria didn't recognize another parent presumably holding a phone, slightly too casually angled, slightly too deliberately, walked past them near the refreshment table, and Victoria caught the flash of a camera app open on the screen, aimed, she was fairly sure, in their direction. She didn't say anything. She didn't want to alarm Nathan, not there, not in front of Lily, not after a moment that good. But something cold moved through her, the same chill Diane had put in her weeks earlier, and she found herself scanning the gymnasium the rest of the visit, with the practiced vigilance of a woman who had spent 20 years learning to read a room for threats. She left before Nathan and Lily did, slipping out a side door, texting him from the parking lot. "That was wonderful. Thank you for letting me come. I think someone took a photo of us. I might be wrong. Just wanted you to know." His reply came a few minutes later. "I saw her too. Probably nothing. Probably just a parent taking pictures of the recital in general, and we happen to be in frame. Try not to worry. Try being the operative word." Victoria drove back to the office that afternoon with the particular unease of a person who has just glimpsed for one instant the shape of the storm that's still miles offshore, but undeniably coming. The weeks that followed were in Nathan's private accounting, some of the best of his life since Kate died. He didn't say that out loud to anyone, not even to Victoria, because it felt like a betrayal of a grief he still carried every single day. A grief that didn't have room he'd always assumed for anything as bright as what was growing now. But it was true. He noticed it in small ways, the fact that he was singing along to the radio again in the car, badly off-key, something Lily found endlessly hilarious and had started filming on her tablet without his permission. The fact that he'd started sleeping through the night instead of the fitful 3-hour stretches that had defined the 2 years since the funeral. The fact that when his phone lit up with Victoria's name, something in his chest lifted instead of the flat neutrality he'd trained himself into with everything else in his life. Victoria came to dinner for the first time on a Thursday in late October, and it was by mutual agreement the smallest possible version of the thing. No reservation, no restaurant. Just Nathan's kitchen table with a pot of spaghetti and a jar of sauce. He was slightly embarrassed to admit was store-bought, and Lily setting the table with a level of ceremony usually reserved for holidays, insisting on cloth napkins that Nathan didn't even know they owned until she produced them from somewhere in the linen closet. "Are you nervous?" Nathan asked Victoria in the driveway, watching her get out of a car that wasn't the town car she usually traveled in, a plain sedan rented, she'd told him specifically, so it wouldn't draw attention, parked outside his house. "Terrified," Victoria admitted. "I negotiated a $400 million acquisition last month without blinking. I am currently more nervous about spaghetti with an 8-year-old. She's tougher than the acquisition," Nathan warned. "Fair notice." Lily met Victoria at the door with the gravity of a diplomat receiving a foreign dignitary. "We're having spaghetti," she announced. "Daddy says it's from a jar, but I think it tastes just as good as the fancy kind." "I trust your judgment completely," Victoria said and followed her inside. Dinner was by any objective measure chaos. Lily narrated an elaborate and entirely fictional story about a class hamster's escape attempt that grew more improbable with each sentence, complete with a villain, a rescue mission, and what she insisted was a twist ending she refused to reveal until dessert. Nathan tried twice to redirect the conversation toward something resembling adult topics and was twice overruled by his daughter's superior storytelling momentum. Victoria laughed more in that hour than she had by her own private accounting in the previous calendar year combined. "Can I ask you something?" Lily said apropos of nothing, right, as Nathan was clearing the plates. "Of course," Victoria said. "Do you have kids?" The kitchen went quiet for a beat. Nathan paused with a plate in his hand, watching Victoria carefully the way a parent watches, to see if a question has landed somewhere sensitive. "No," Victoria said. "I never had children." "Do you want some?" "Lily." Nathan said a gentle warning. "It's okay," Victoria said again, and she meant it. She looked at Lily at the wide-open curiosity in her face, utterly without malice, just an 8-year-old trying to understand the shape of a new person's life. "I used to think I didn't have time. I was always building the company, always in meetings, always somewhere else. I think if I'm honest, I was scared too. I didn't want to be bad at it the way I thought my own parents were bad at it." "Were they bad at it?" "My father was very good at building things," Victoria said carefully. "He wasn't very good at staying home for dinner." Lily nodded like this made complete sense to her, filed it away the way she filed away most information, and then said with the devastating simplicity children are capable of, "You could practice on me sometimes if you want. I'm pretty easy. I just need someone to listen to my hamster stories and not tell me the ending is too weird." Victoria felt her throat tighten, and she had to look down at her plate for a second before she could answer. "I would like that very much." Nathan, standing at the sink with his back to them, had gone very still, And when he turned around, his eyes were wet, though he tried to hide it by suddenly becoming very interested in drying a dish that was already dry. Later that night, after Lily had been put to bed, Victoria staying downstairs insisting she was fine on the couch, insisting Nathan didn't need to rush the bedtime routine on her account. Nathan came back down and found her sitting exactly where he'd left her, looking at the photo of Kate on the side table. "She has your smile," Victoria said quietly, nodding at the picture meaning Lily. "Everyone says that." Nathan sat down beside her, close but not touching. "I see Kate in her more than I see myself. The way she tilts her head when she's skeptical of something. The way she negotiates bedtime like she's arguing a Supreme Court case. You talk about her like she's still here. She is in a way. Just not in the way I want her to be." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "I used to think loving Lily's mother meant I couldn't ever really love anyone else. Like there wasn't room. Like it would be a betrayal. And now I think—" He stopped, seemed to search for the right words, the careful precision of a man who didn't say things he didn't mean. "I think Kate would have liked you. I think she would have been glad Lily has someone who listens to her hamster stories like they matter. I don't think love works like a pie where there's only so much to go around. I think it just grows to fit whoever's in the room." Victoria felt tears on her face before she quite registered she was crying. And this time, she didn't try to hide it or explain it away. Nathan reached over slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull back, and wiped one tear away with his thumb. And the gesture was so gentle, so entirely without agenda, that it undid something in her that she'd spent 20 years keeping locked. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. "I don't know how to be a person who has this. I've spent my whole life building something that doesn't need anyone. I don't know how to need someone." "You don't have to know how," Nathan said. "You just have to keep showing up. That's the whole trick. Nobody actually knows how. We're all just showing up and hoping we don't screw it up too badly." "That's not very comforting." "It's the most honest thing I know how to tell you." She leaned into him then, and he put his arm around her, and they sat there in the small living room with its second-hand couch and its bookshelf full of a dead woman's chapter books for her daughter. And Victoria thought with a clarity that startled her, that this small, unglamorous, entirely unphotographed moment was worth more than every boardroom victory she'd ever claimed. It was almost impossible for something like this to stay contained, and both of them knew it even as they tried. Richard Callahan had built his career on knowing things before other people wanted him to know them. He'd clawed his way onto the Sterling board 12 years earlier through a combination of genuine competence and a willingness to do the parts of the job that made other people squeamish the layoffs Victoria's father had needed, but hadn't wanted his name attached to the union negotiations that required someone comfortable being hated. He'd expected for years that his loyalty would be rewarded with the CEO chair eventually when Victoria's father retired. Instead, the old man had handed the company to his daughter, and Richard had spent every year since nursing a grievance he'd learned to disguise as professional concern. He heard about Nathan Brooks from a source he wouldn't have described as reliable under oath, a junior associate at the PR firm Sterling Logistics, retained, who'd mentioned almost as gossip that someone in the office had fielded an unusual request from Victoria's assistant asking about the confidentiality protections around a company contractor's employee, a claims administrator named Nathan Brooks. Richard had filed it away. He filed most things away. It was a habit that had served him well over the years, a mental ledger of small inconsistencies waiting to become useful. He didn't act on it immediately. He simply began to watch in the way men like Richard watch a comment here, a question there, a casual mention to Diane about how relaxed Victoria seemed lately. Wasn't that nice? Must be good for the company to have her so at ease. It was Richard who hired the photographer. He would never phrase it that way, of course, not even in his own head. He would describe it, if pressed, as due diligence, a board member's responsibility to understand any factor that might affect the company's stability or public perception, particularly given how carefully Sterling Logistics' brand had been built around Victoria's image as a serious, unassailable, almost ascetic business leader. A romantic entanglement with a company outside their social tier, a widower with a young child, A man who worked an ordinary job doing ordinary things. That was exactly the kind of narrative that could destabilize investor confidence. Richard told himself exactly the kind of story a competitor could weaponize. He told himself all of this, and some small, honest part of him knew it was a lie. Knew that what he actually wanted was leverage. Wanted a way to finally push Victoria out of a chair he'd coveted for over a decade. Wanted a crack in her armor wide enough to drive a wedge through. The photographer he hired a freelancer named Curtis Vance, who specialized in exactly this kind of work. Low-profile surveillance dressed up as paparazzi opportunism, spent 3 weeks establishing a pattern before he got anything usable. He photographed Victoria's rental sedan parked outside Nathan's house on 4 separate evenings. He photographed her leaving at odd hours, once close to midnight. And on a Sunday afternoon in early November, from a position across the street, with a long lens disguised inside an ordinary duffel bag, he photographed Victoria Sterling in Nathan Brooks' backyard, laughing, her head thrown back, while Nathan pushed Lily on a rope swing tied to the oak tree. And Lily shrieked with delight, loud enough that the sound carried across the yard and into the frame of every photograph Curtis took. It was by any measure an ordinary, beautiful afternoon. A billionaire, an insurance administrator, and a little girl on a rope swing. None of them performing for anyone. None of them aware they were being watched. None of them imagining that this small private happiness was about to become public property. Curtis sold the photographs to a tabloid website 2 days later for a number that made Richard's payment to him look, in retrospect, like an excellent investment. Nathan found out the same way most people find out their private life has become public spectacle from someone else secondhand, delivered with the particular cruelty of a person who enjoys being the one to break bad news. It was his co-worker Denise from underwriting who stopped by his cubicle Monday morning with her phone already open. "Nathan, please tell me this isn't what it looks like." She turned the screen toward him. There was his own face, unmistakably. His own face laughing in his own backyard, arm extended toward his own daughter on the rope swing, and beside him, unmistakably, achingly recognizable. Even in a grainy long-lens photograph. Victoria Sterling, head thrown back laughing, like she hadn't laughed in that gymnasium or that kitchen or any of the private spaces they'd carefully guarded for months. The headline ran across the top of the article in bold red letters. Billionaire's secret lover revealed insurance clerk Nathan Brooks and the child caught in the middle. Nathan felt the floor tilt slightly under him. "Where did you get this?" "It's everywhere, Nathan. It's on 3 different sites already. Someone tagged our company page in the comments." Denise's expression shifted from shock to something more calculating, more careful, the look of a co-worker recalibrating how much distance to keep. "Is it true? It's—" Nathan stopped himself. There was no version of the truth that would fit into a hallway conversation with Denise from underwriting. No way to explain 11 weeks of phone calls and honesty and a woman crying on his couch about being lonely in a 14-room house. Not in a way that would survive translation into office gossip. "It's complicated," he said finally, which was true and useless and did nothing to slow the wave that was already breaking over his life. By 10 a.m., his supervisor had called him into a small conference room with a closed door, which in Nathan's 8 years at the company had only ever meant one thing. "Nathan, I want you to know this isn't personal." His supervisor. A nervous man named Gary Fitch said, sliding a piece of paper across the table without quite meeting his eyes. "But corporate's gotten calls all morning. Reporters. Someone even called asking about our contract with Sterling Logistics regional carriers, wanting to know if there's a conflict of interest. We need to put you on administrative leave while this gets sorted out." "Paid," he added quickly, as if that made it better. "It's just optics, Nathan. You understand." Nathan understood. He understood with a clarity that made his hands go cold. This was what Victoria had been trying to protect him from without ever quite saying it outright, the machinery that existed to consume any story with her name attached to it. And now that machinery had found him, and it wasn't going to stop at him. He called Lily's school before lunch, some instinct telling him to check, and the school secretary confirmed what he'd feared before he'd even fully articulated the fear to himself. 2 parents had already called that morning, asking whether it was appropriate for Lily to remain in her current class, whether the school had policies about this kind of media attention language so bureaucratic and cold that Nathan wanted to put his fist through something. He picked Lily up early, telling the front office it was a doctor's appointment, and drove home with his daughter chattering in the back seat about a spelling test, entirely unaware that her small, careful world had just been cracked open by adults she'd never met for reasons she wouldn't understand for years. That night, after Lily was asleep, though sleep for Nathan felt like an impossibly distant country he called Victoria, she picked up on the first ring. "Nathan, I am so sorry. I've seen it. I've had my lawyers on the phone all day trying to get it taken down, but it's everywhere now. I got put on leave." Nathan said, his voice flatter than he intended, exhaustion flattening everything. "Paid leave. For optics." Nathan, two parents already called Lily's school today. About her. About whether she should be in her class. His voice cracked slightly, and he hated that it did. Hated that even now, in the middle of this part of him was still performing strength because that's what fathers did. That's what he'd trained himself to do since Kate died. "She's 8, Victoria. She didn't do anything. She just wanted someone to listen to her hamster stories." "I know." Victoria's voice was thick. "I know, and I am so sorry, and I don't know how to fix this." "Maybe it can't be fixed," Nathan said, and the words felt like stones in his mouth, heavy and wrong even as he said them. "Maybe this was always going to happen. I told myself it wouldn't. I told myself we could keep it small, keep it ours. But people like you don't get to have small things. Everything about your life is public property. Victoria, and I think I forgot that, or I let myself forget it because I wanted—" He stopped, pressed his palm against his eyes. "I wanted this to be real. I wanted it to just be us. But it was never going to just be us, was it?" "Don't," Victoria said, and there was something fierce in it now, cutting through the guilt. "Don't do that. Don't tell yourself this was inevitable like it's some kind of law of physics. This isn't inevitable, Nathan. This is cruelty. Someone did this on purpose. Someone hired a photographer and sold pictures of us to a tabloid because it was profitable, or because it served someone's agenda, and that is not the same thing as fate. That is a choice someone made, and I intend to find out who made it. That doesn't fix what's happening to Lily right now." "I know." Her voice broke slightly. "I know it doesn't. I would give anything to undo the part of this that's touching her. She's a child. She never asked for any of this, and if there was a way to take that back to make it so none of this ever reached her, I would do it in a heartbeat, whatever it cost me." Nathan sat with that for a long moment. The anger and the exhaustion and the fear all tangled together in his chest, and underneath all of it, still stubbornly, the thing that hadn't changed. He still believed her. Every word of it. "If leaving me protects your company," he said quietly, and it cost him something enormous to say it more than he'd expected, "do it. Lily and I survived before we met you. We'll survive after." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Nathan wondered if the call had dropped. "Nathan Brooks," Victoria said finally. Her voice low and absolutely steady, all the tears gone out of it, replaced by something that sounded to Nathan's ear almost like her boardroom voice, the voice she must have used to face down 20 years of men who underestimated her. "I did not spend 41 years building a life I was ashamed of, just so I could abandon the first true thing that ever happened to me the moment it became inconvenient. I am not leaving you. And I am absolutely not leaving that little girl who asked me to practice being a parent on her hamster stories." "Victoria, I need you to hear me," she said. "Whoever did this wanted exactly what you just offered me. They wanted me to cut you loose to protect the company, to protect my reputation, because that's what people like me are supposed to do. That's the rational, defensible business decision. I am telling you now, and I will keep telling you as many times as you need to hear it, I am not doing that. You and Lily are not a liability I'm managing. You are the only real thing I have. I would rather lose the company than lose you." Nathan closed his eyes, and for the first time since Denise had shown him that phone screen that morning, something in his chest loosened just slightly, just enough to breathe. "They're not going to make this easy," he said. "No," Victoria agreed. "They're not. But I didn't build a logistics empire out of 3 trucks and a warehouse by backing down from hard things. Let them try." There was steel in her voice now, the kind Nathan hadn't heard from her before, not in 11 weeks of late-night phone calls about loneliness and lost spouses, and a shared ache for something more honest than the lives they'd been living. This was Victoria Sterling, the businesswoman. Victoria Sterling, who had fought off hostile takeovers and outmaneuvered men twice her age, in boardrooms designed to make women like her fail. And hearing that steel now aimed in defense of him and his daughter did something to Nathan that he wouldn't fully understand. Until much later it made him trust her more completely than he had ever trusted anyone since Kate. "I have a board meeting in 3 days, Victoria continued. "Richard Callahan is going to use this. I don't know exactly how yet, but I know him, and I know he's been waiting years for something like this to hand him. I need you to know that whatever happens in that room, whatever gets said about you, about Lily, about us, none of it is going to change what I just told you." "I believe you," Nathan said, and found somewhat to his own surprise that he meant it completely. "Get some sleep," Victoria said softly, the fire banking back down into something gentler. "Kiss Lily for me in the morning. Tell her the lonely lady says her hamster stories are the best part of my week." "I will." Nathan. "Yeah. I meant what I said. All of it." "I know," he said. "That's what scares me most. I know you did." He hung up the phone and sat in the dark living room for a long time, looking at the photo of Kate on the side table, and for the first time since the article broke that morning, he let himself cry, not from fear, not entirely, but from something more complicated, something that felt almost like relief. The strange, disorienting relief of discovering that the person you'd let yourself love wasn't going to run at the first sign of real cost. Upstairs, Lily slept soundly, unaware that somewhere across the city in a house with 14 empty rooms, a woman who loved her father was already awake again, drafting notes for a fight she intended to win, because the alternative, losing the only 2 people who had ever made her feel like more than a name on a masthead, was not a version of the future she was willing to accept. The 3 days between Nathan's phone call and the board meeting felt to Victoria like living inside a slowly tightening fist. The story had metastasized overnight, the way these things always did, once the first outlet ran with it. By Tuesday morning, it wasn't just the tabloid site that had bought Curtis Vance's photographs. It was 3 more sites. Then a morning news segment that ran a 60-second package under the Chiron Billionaire's secret family. Then a business journalist who'd built a career skewering wealthy executives publishing a column titled, "What is Victoria Sterling Hiding?" that had nothing to do with facts and everything to do with clicks. Diane appeared in Victoria's office at 7 a.m. with a printed stack of clippings an inch thick. Her face arranged in the careful neutrality she used when she had bad news, and wanted to deliver all of it before Victoria could interrupt. "It's not just the tabloids anymore," Diane said. "Bloomberg picked it up this morning, framed as a governance question whether the CEO's personal life creates material risk for the company. 2 analysts have already downgraded their sentiment rating, citing leadership distraction." Victoria took the stack without looking at it. Stock price, down 3% since market open. Not catastrophic. But Richard's already made 2 calls to major shareholders this morning. I know because one of them called me back confused, asking why a board member was soliciting his opinion on the CEO's personal judgment. Victoria set the papers down slowly, her jaw tight. "He's building a case. He's building a coup," Diane corrected. "Victoria, I need you to hear me as your friend right now, not just your assistant. Richard has wanted your chair since your father handed it to you instead of him. This isn't about Nathan. Nathan is just the crowbar. If it wasn't this, it would have been something else eventually. But it is this, and it is now, and you need a plan before Thursday, because Richard already has one." Victoria looked out at the skyline, the same view she'd stared at the night she'd first called Nathan, and found that the fear she expected to feel, the corporate fear, the fear of losing the empire her father built, was oddly muted, standing in the shadow of a much larger fear that in trying to protect what she'd built with Nathan and Lily, she might destroy it faster than any board vote ever could. What's Richard's play exactly? What's he actually going to propose? My best guess based on the calls he's making. A vote of no confidence or at minimum a formal censure language about conduct unbecoming and reputational risk to shareholders. He doesn't need to remove you outright. He just needs enough votes to force you into a public statement distancing yourself from Nathan. That's the real goal. He wants you to renounce it publicly on record, so the story dies, and so everyone in that boardroom remembers exactly whose judgment they should trust going forward. And if I refuse... Diane's expression didn't waver. Then he pushes for the vote of no confidence, and you find out in real time exactly how many people on that board actually respect you, versus how many just respect the stock price. Victoria sat with that for a long moment. Then she picked up her phone. Nathan's administrative leave had by Wednesday curdled into something worse. Gary Fitch called him again this time, with less apology in his voice. Nathan, I have to be straight with you. Corporate's getting nervous. There's talk, and I want to stress this is just talk right now, about whether continuing your employment here is tenable, given the attention. Given the attention, Nathan repeated flatly. You mean given that my private life got stolen and sold to a tabloid without my consent? I know it's not fair, Gary said, and had the decency to sound like he meant it. But fair isn't really the operative concern for the people upstairs. I'm sorry, Nathan, I really am. You're one of the best people on this floor, but I don't make these calls. Nathan hung up and sat in his car in the school parking lot he'd taken to picking Lily up early every day, now unwilling to leave her exposed to the whispers that had already started among the other parents, and put his forehead against the steering wheel for a long moment, before he trusted himself to go inside and be the calm, steady father Lily needed him to be. That evening over dinner, Lily barely touched, she finally asked the question Nathan had been dreading. Why does Madison keep saying things about you and the lonely lady? Nathan set down his fork carefully. What kind of things bug? She said you're famous now. She said her mom said you're only friends with Victoria because she's rich and that you're trying to get her money. Lily's voice wobbled slightly more confused than upset, still trying to make sense of an accusation that didn't match anything she'd witnessed with her own eyes. That's not true, right? You like Victoria because she's nice, not because of money. Something in Nathan's chest cracked wide open, a pain sharper than anything the leave or the reporters, camped intermittently at the end of his street, had managed to produce. It was one thing for the world to come after him. It was another thing entirely for it to reach into his 8-year-old's understanding of her own father and plant a seed of doubt about who he was. Lily, look at me. He waited until she did. I have never once in my life wanted Victoria's money, not $1 of it. I like Victoria because she listens to your hamster stories like they matter. I like her because she's kind and because she makes both of us laugh and because I think your mom would have liked her too. That's it. That's the whole reason. Anybody who tells you different doesn't know what they're talking about. Madison's mom seemed pretty sure. Madison's mom has never had dinner with us. She's never heard Victoria clap so hard at your recital, it sounded like she was trying to put out a fire. She's just repeating something she read on the internet, and the internet, Lily, is not always right, even when it sounds very confident. Lily nodded, slowly chewing on this. Is it going to stop people talking about us? Nathan wanted more than almost anything he'd wanted in years to promise her yes, to promise her this would blow over in a week, and life would go back to the small, manageable shape it had before that photograph existed. But he'd learned, since Kate died, never to promise Lily things he couldn't guarantee, because false comfort cost more than honest uncertainty in the long run. I don't know, he said instead. I hope so, but I know this. Whatever happens, whatever people say, you and me, we're going to be okay. We were okay before any of this, and we'll be okay no matter how it turns out. That part, I can promise. Lily seemed to find enough in that to settle at least for the moment, and went back to her dinner, and Nathan sat there thinking that somewhere out there, in whatever boardroom she occupied, Victoria was fighting a battle of her own, and he hoped with an intensity that surprised him that she was winning it. The board meeting convened at 9 a.m. Thursday in the glass-walled conference room on the 40th floor of Sterling Logistics headquarters. 12 directors seated around a table, long enough to seat twice that number. The city spread out silently below them, like something that didn't know its own indifference. Richard Callahan sat near the head of the table, 3 seats down from where Victoria always sat. A position he'd chosen deliberately years ago because it put him in her direct line of sight without appearing presumptuous enough to sit beside her. He wore his gray suit, the one he wore for meetings he considered important, and he had a leather folder in front of him that Victoria recognized from 20 years of reading rooms like this one as containing prepared remarks. He'd come ready to perform, not just to argue. Victoria walked in at 9:02, 2 minutes late by design, because arriving exactly on time read as anxious, and arriving significantly late read as disrespectful, and 2 minutes communicated exactly the kind of unbothered control she needed the room to feel from her, whether or not she felt it herself. "Let's begin?" she said, taking her seat, with the elephant in the room, since I assume that's why half of you have that particular look on your faces. Yes, the photographs are real. Yes, I've been in a relationship with a man named Nathan Brooks for the past 3 months. No, it is not a scandal, and no, it will not be treated as one in this meeting. A murmur moved around the table, not quite dissent, not quite support the sound of a dozen people recalibrating in real time. Richard didn't wait for an invitation. "Victoria, with respect, I don't think you get to unilaterally declare what is and isn't a scandal when our stock has dropped 4% this week, and 2 major analysts have flagged leadership distraction as an emerging risk factor. The stock dropped because of a media narrative, Richard, not because of any actual change in the company's fundamentals. Our quarterly numbers haven't moved. Our contracts haven't moved. The only thing that's changed is that a photographer sold pictures of me at a child's birthday." She caught herself corrected. "At a private family gathering to a tabloid, and certain parties have chosen to amplify that story, rather than let it die a natural death." "Certain parties." Richard repeated, an edge in his voice. "Are you accusing someone at this table?" "I'm not accusing anyone of anything," Victoria said evenly, though her eyes stayed on him a beat longer than was comfortable. "I'm simply observing that a story like this doesn't sustain itself for 4 days without help. Someone keeps feeding it. Someone's been making calls to shareholders about my personal judgment. I wonder who that could be." The room went very still. Richard's jaw tightened, but his voice, when it came, stayed smooth, practiced. "I've made calls to shareholders because it's my fiduciary duty as a board member to gauge sentiment when a governance risk emerges. That's not a conspiracy, Victoria. That's the job." "Then let's talk about the job," Victoria said, and opened her own folder for the first time. "Because I think the actual governance risk in this room isn't a man named Nathan Brooks. It's a board member who spent the last several days lobbying shareholders to distrust their CEO, based on a photograph of her laughing in a backyard." "This isn't about the photograph," Richard snapped, some of his composure slipping for the first time. "It's about optics and pattern of judgment, and whether the market can trust that the person running this company is making decisions with a clear head, or whether she's what, Richard?" Victoria's voice cut clean and cold across the table. "Say it. Say the word you're circling." A long pause. Richard didn't say it. He didn't have to. Everyone at the table had already heard the shape of it hovering unspoken. Distracted, compromised, unfit words men had used for 100 years to describe women who dared to have a life alongside their power. "I move," Richard said instead, opening his folder, "that the board formally request Ms. Sterling issue a public statement clarifying and, given the circumstances, distancing herself from this relationship in the interest of restoring market confidence and shareholder trust." Another director, an older man named Franklin Ostro, who'd sat on the board since Victoria's father's era and rarely spoke unless the matter genuinely troubled him, cleared his throat. "Richard, with respect, are we seriously proposing to dictate who our CEO is allowed to love? Because I've sat on a lot of boards in 40 years, and I've never once seen us pass a resolution about a man's girlfriend. I'd like someone to explain to me why this is different." "It's different," Richard said, "because of who he is, a claims administrator. No wealth, no pedigree, no connection to this industry beyond a brother-in-law who drives a truck for one of our contractors. It raises questions about motive that a more comparable match wouldn't raise. Victoria felt something ignite in her chest, sharp and clean, the specific fury of hearing someone she loved reduced to a background check. "Say that again," she said very quietly, "and be careful how you say it." Richard, sensing he'd overstepped some line, but unwilling to retreat entirely, adjusted his tone without changing his substance. "I'm simply raising the questions our shareholders are already asking Victoria. Is this man after your money? Is your judgment compromised by—" "Nathan Brooks," Victoria said, standing now her palms flat on the table, "has never once asked me for a single dollar. Not a job, not an investment, not an introduction to a single person in my network. In 3 months, the only thing that man has ever asked of me is that I show up and be honest and let his 8-year-old daughter tell me stories about her hamster. Meanwhile, in that same 3 months, you, Richard, have made calls to at least 4 major shareholders that I know of actively working to undermine my position, using a private relationship as your instrument. If we want to talk about motive in this room, I don't think mine is the one that needs examining." Richard's face had gone red. "This is exactly the kind of emotional reasoning that concerns the board, Victoria. You're not thinking clearly. "I am thinking with more clarity than I have in a decade, Richard," Victoria said, and something in her voice made even Franklin Ostro sit up straighter. "For 20 years I ran this company the way my father taught me. Never show weakness, never let anyone see you need anything, measure every relationship by what it can do for the bottom line. And you know what? That got me. An empire and an empty house. 14 rooms, and not one voice waiting to say my name at the end of the day. Nathan Brooks walked into my life and didn't want a single thing from it. And for the first time since I was a young woman, I remembered what it felt like to be a person instead of a brand. I am not renouncing that. Not for a stock price, not for you." The silence that followed lasted long enough that the low hum of the building's climate system became audible, a strange, mundane sound underneath the weight of what had just been said. Richard recovered first, his voice tight. "Then I'll call the vote. All in favor of requiring a formal statement distancing Ms. Sterling from this relationship as a condition of maintaining board confidence." "Before you call anything," Victoria interrupted, "I want the room to know something else. Something I only confirmed this morning, which is part of why I asked for this meeting rather than waiting to be summoned to one." She reached into her folder and withdrew a slim stack of documents, laying them on the table with a deliberateness that drew every eye in the room. "These are wire transfer records," she said, "and an invoice from a private investigation and media relations firm called Ashcroft Consulting. The invoice is for targeted media placement and photographic acquisition services regarding, and I quote, the Sterling/Brooks matter. The wire transfer originated from a personal account. Richard's personal account." The room detonated into noise chairs, scraping voices overlapping Franklin Ostro's low disbelieving, "Good Lord," audible over the rest. Richard's face had drained from red to something closer to gray. Those are forged. That's completely fabricated. I have never..." "My legal team obtained them through entirely legitimate channels this morning. Richard, after a member of Ashcroft's staff, uncomfortable with what they'd been asked to facilitate, reached out to us directly. You hired a photographer. You had him surveil a private citizen and his 8-year-old daughter for 3 weeks. You paid to have the resulting photographs placed with a tabloid, and you have spent the 4 days since manufacturing a governance crisis out of the fallout, specifically so you could use it to force my hand in exactly the meeting we are currently having. That is not fiduciary diligence, Richard. That is a coordinated campaign to destroy a private family in order to seize my chair. This is..." Richard's voice cracked, all the polish gone from it now, replaced by something desperate and cornered. "This is a smear. This is exactly the kind of emotional manipulation I warned this board about. Would you like to explain the wire transfer, Richard?" Franklin Ostro asked, his voice flat and hard, in a way none of them had heard from him in years. "Because I'd very much like to hear an innocent explanation for why a board member of this company personally financed surveillance of the CEO's private life. Richard opened his mouth. Nothing came out. In 22 years of board meetings, in a career built on always having the smooth answer ready, Richard Callahan found himself for the first time with nothing at all to say. "I'll make this simple," Victoria said into the silence he left. "Any company that protects its stock price by sacrificing an innocent child no longer deserves to exist. And any board member willing to weaponize a little girl's private life to seize control of a company he didn't build does not deserve to sit at this table." I'm not asking for a vote on my relationship with Nathan Brooks. I'm calling for a vote on Richard Callahan's continued position on this board, effective immediately pending full review of these financial records by outside counsel, and if warranted referral to appropriate authorities. The vote, when it came, was not close. 9 votes in favor of Richard's immediate removal, 2 abstentions, and Richard himself staring at the table in front of him, unable to meet a single pair of eyes in the room. He stood, gathered his folder with hands that were visibly shaking, and paused at the door. "You've made a mistake, Victoria. This company was built by people who understood that sentiment doesn't run a business." "This company," Victoria said, "was built by my father, who taught me that weakness was unforgivable, and I spent 20 years believing him, and it cost me every relationship I ever had, until a man in a rented Honda Civic reminded me that being human isn't a weakness at all. It's the only thing worth building anything for. Goodbye, Richard." He left without another word, and the door closed behind him with a soft, anticlimactic click that somehow carried more weight than a slam would have. "Chibida," Victoria called Nathan from the elevator, still shaking slightly with adrenaline, her voice unsteady, in a way that alarmed him for the first 3 seconds, until she got the words out. "It's done. Richard's gone. The board voted him off this morning." "Victoria." Nathan sat down heavily on his own kitchen chair, the weight of 4 days of dread finally beginning to lift. "What happened?" She told him the wire transfer records, Richard's face going gray, Franklin Ostro's quiet fury, the vote that wasn't close. Nathan listened without interrupting, and when she finished, there was a long pause on the line, thick with everything neither of them had let themselves feel fully over the last 4 days. "You didn't have to do that," Nathan said finally, his voice rough. "You could have just distanced yourself, made the statement he wanted, kept the company clean and let this die down. Nobody would have blamed you." "I would have blamed myself," Victoria said simply. "For the rest of my life. Nathan, I have spent 2 decades protecting a company. I have never once, not until 3 months ago, had anything worth protecting the way I want to protect you and Lily. I wasn't going to let a man like Richard teach me at 41 years old that some things aren't worth defending." Nathan closed his eyes, feeling something enormous move through his chest, relief and gratitude, and underneath both of those, something that felt dangerously, wonderfully close to hope. "Lily asked me yesterday if this was going to stop. The reporters, the whispers at school. I told her I didn't know. Can I tell her now?" "Tell her," Victoria said, and he could hear the smile breaking through in her voice, even through the phone. "Tell her the lonely lady isn't lonely anymore, and neither is she going anywhere." That evening, Nathan sat Lily down at the kitchen table and told her in the careful, honest language he always used with her, that the hard part was over. That a bad man who had caused all the trouble had been caught and removed. That Victoria had stood up for both of them in front of a room full of powerful people, that they weren't going to have to be afraid of the phone ringing or the whispers at school anymore, not the way they had been. Lily listened with the particular seriousness she reserved for information that mattered, and when Nathan finished, she asked the question that more than anything the board vote had accomplished, told him everything he needed to know about what these 3 months had built. "Does this mean Victoria's basically part of our family now?" Nathan felt his throat tighten, thought of Kate's photograph on the side table. Thought of 11 weeks of phone calls and a woman crying in his living room about being unseen. Thought of a rope swing and a laugh thrown back toward a November sky that a stranger's camera had tried and failed to turn into something ugly. "Yeah, Bug," he said quietly. "I think that's exactly what it means." Lily nodded, satisfied, the way she nodded at most things that finally made sense to her, and went back to her homework, entirely unaware that somewhere across the city, in an office on the 40th floor, a woman who loved them both was standing at her window, watching the sun go down over a city that no longer felt quite so lonely, already thinking about the life she wanted to build, on the other side of everything that had almost taken it from her. Richard Callahan's removal from the board should have ended things cleanly. It didn't. Men who lose that publicly rarely go quietly, and Richard, stripped of his chair, but not yet stripped of his pride, spent the following week discovering exactly how much damage a wounded man with money and grudges could still do on his way out the door. The first sign came through Diane 3 days after the board meeting, in the form of a phone call she took with her office door closed, and emerged from looking paler than Victoria had seen her look in years. That was a reporter from the Journal, Diane said, setting her phone down carefully, like it might go off again if handled wrong. Someone's shopping around a story that Richard didn't just hire the photographer, that he's been quietly encouraging 2 of your largest institutional shareholders to file a formal complaint with the SEC, alleging you used board resources to fabricate evidence against him in order to eliminate a political rival. Victoria felt her stomach drop. That's insane. The wire transfer records were real. Franklin saw them himself. I know that. You know that. But Richard doesn't need it to be true, Victoria. He just needs it to be loud enough, long enough to make people wonder. He's spent 22 years learning exactly how this game works. He's not finished. Nathan. When Victoria called to tell him absorb the news with a stillness that had become his default position over the past 2 weeks. Not passivity she'd come to understand, but a kind of grim, methodical calm. The same calm he probably used at his old desk when a claim came in that looked bad on paper and needed careful handling before anyone panicked. What does he actually want? Nathan asked. At this point, he's off the board. What's left for him to gain? I don't think he wants to gain anything anymore, Victoria said slowly, working it out as she said it. I think he wants to make sure that even if he goes down, he takes something with him. My reputation, the company's stability, maybe both. Wounded pride doesn't calculate cost-benefit the way a rational actor does, Nathan. It just wants to hurt something on the way out. That's a terrifying way to describe a man who's still got money and lawyers. It's an accurate way, Victoria said grimly. She hung up and sat at her desk for a long time, staring at the same skyline that had witnessed every turning point of the last 4 months, the sleepless night after the gala. The call she'd almost not made the night she'd cried on Nathan's couch, the morning she'd walked into a boardroom and gambled everything on a stack of wire transfer records. She thought about her father dead 6 years now and the specific brand of ruthlessness he'd have brought to a situation like this. Crush it, fast. Crush it, completely, worry about the collateral damage. Never. She'd spent her whole life trying to be exactly that kind of leader, and it had cost her, she now understood, more than it had ever earned her. She picked up the phone and called her general counsel instead of her father's ghost. I want a full forensic audit, she said. Everything. Every dollar Richard Callahan touched in his 22 years on this board. Every consulting contract, every vendor relationship, every donation to a non-profit that happened to employ his nephew. If he wants a war of documentation, I want to make sure we're the ones holding all the paper when it's over. The audit took 11 days, and what it surfaced went considerably beyond a single wire transfer to a surveillance firm, Richard Callahan. It turned out had spent nearly a decade quietly steering contracts toward companies with connections to his extended family. Nothing dramatic enough to have triggered scrutiny on its own, small enough to hide in the margins of a company that processed thousands of vendor relationships a year, but substantial enough in aggregate to represent millions of dollars diverted from more competitive bids. None of it had anything to do with Nathan. All of it had everything to do with the kind of man Richard actually was, underneath the tailored suits and the concerned shareholder language, a man who had learned over 2 decades exactly how much a company the size of Sterling Logistics could absorb before anyone noticed what was missing. Victoria sat with her general counsel and the head of internal audit in a conference room that felt considerably less charged than the one where she'd faced Richard down 2 weeks earlier, going through the findings page by page, and felt something colder than anger settle over her. The particular clarity of understanding that the man who'd tried to weaponize her private life had for years been quietly bleeding the company she'd inherited from her father. "What do you want to do with this?" her general counsel asked, closing the file. Victoria thought about it for a long moment. Part of her, the part her father had raised, the part that had built an empire on ruthlessness, wanted to bury Richard so completely that his name became a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms for the next 30 years. But another part of her, the part that had grown these past 4 months in kitchens and school gymnasiums and on a rope swing under an oak tree, wanted something different. Not mercy exactly, something closer to precision. "We're not going public with a smear campaign," she said finally. "We're not going to fight him with his own weapons. We're going to hand every documented finding to the SEC and the appropriate authorities in full, with full cooperation, and let the process work the way it's supposed to work. No leaks, no tabloid placements, no hired photographers. We beat him by being exactly what he wasn't." "That's the slower path," her counsel warned. "Public opinion moves faster than regulatory investigations. If he keeps talking to reporters in the meantime, the story could stay muddy for months." "Then it stays muddy for months," Victoria said. "I'm not interested in winning a fight the way Richard fights. I've had enough of that kind of winning. It cost me 20 years, and it nearly cost me the only 2 people who've made me want something different." Her general counsel studied her for a moment, then nodded, something like respect moving across his face. "Your father would have gone nuclear on this within the hour." "I know," Victoria said. "That's exactly why I'm not going to." Doug. Nathan's reinstatement at the insurance company came through 2 weeks later, delivered by Gary Fitch with considerably more warmth than his previous calls. Now that the story had shifted decisively in Nathan's favor, the SEC referral had leaked, as these things always eventually did, and the narrative in the press had pivoted almost overnight from Billionaire's scandalous secret to disgraced board members' smear campaign, exposed with Nathan recast awkwardly and without his consent as a sympathetic figure caught in someone else's corporate war. "We'd like you back full-time," Gary said, not quite meeting Nathan's eyes. The particular shame of a man who knew he'd folded too easily under pressure and was now hoping it wouldn't be mentioned. "No hard feelings, I hope. Corporate got a little jumpy there for a while." "A little jumpy?" Nathan repeated, and let the silence stretch just long enough to make Gary uncomfortable before he said, "I appreciate the offer, Gary. I'll think about it." He didn't think about it very long. Whatever bitterness lingered from the administrative leave, from the 2 weeks of not knowing whether he'd have a job to return to, from watching Lily's school life get quietly poisoned by adults who should have known better, none of it changed the fundamental math of his life. He had a mortgage. He had a daughter who needed stability more than she needed a father making a righteous point about corporate cowardice. He went back the following Monday, and if some of his coworkers treated him with a new awkward deference that hadn't existed before the photograph, he did his best to ignore it and do his job the way he'd always done it, quietly, competently, without needing anyone's approval to know his own worth. What he couldn't ignore, what none of them could ignore, was Lily. She'd weathered the worst of it with more resilience than Nathan had expected, but resilience wasn't the same as being unmarked, and he noticed it in small ways over those weeks. The way she'd started double-checking before telling stories at school, asking herself visibly whether this particular detail might get repeated to a parent and turned into something ugly. The way she flinched almost imperceptibly whenever a phone came out at pickup, some reflexive bracing against the idea that she might again become the subject of someone else's photograph. He brought it up with Victoria on a Sunday afternoon, the 2 of them sitting on his back porch while Lily rode her bike in slow looping circles around the small backyard well within eyesight, her laughter drifting back to them every few minutes in a way that had become for both of them one of the sweetest sounds either could remember. "She's different," Nathan said quietly, watching his daughter navigate around the same oak tree that had appeared in Curtis Vance's photographs weeks earlier. "Not broken. Just more careful than an 8-year-old should have to be. I don't know how to fix that." "I don't know if you can fix it," Victoria admitted. "I don't know if anyone can unteach a child that the world might be watching before she's ready for that." But I think you can build enough safety around her that it matters less over time. I think that's the best any of us can do. You've been thinking about this. I've been thinking about a lot of things, Victoria said, and there was something in her voice that made Nathan turn to look at her fully. I've been thinking about how much of my company's culture actually reflects the world I want Lily growing up in, and the honest answer is not much. We don't have real flexibility for single parents. We don't have meaningful childcare support. We have policies my father wrote 30 years ago that assume every employee has a spouse at home managing the parts of life that don't fit neatly into a workday. And that assumption was already wrong when he wrote it, and it's laughably wrong now. What are you saying? I'm saying I think I've spent 20 years building a company that runs on the same ruthlessness my father taught me. And I think that ruthlessness is exactly what almost cost me you and Lily. I don't want to run the company that way anymore. I don't think I can honestly not after everything that's happened. I keep thinking about that morning in the board meeting when I said any company that protects its stock price by sacrificing an innocent child doesn't deserve to exist. I meant it as a threat to Richard, but I've realized since then it's actually true of a lot more than just that one situation. Nathan watched her carefully, something warm and unfamiliar moving through his chest. Not surprise exactly, because nothing about Victoria's honesty surprised him anymore, but something closer to pride, watching a woman who had spent decades building an identity around invulnerability, slowly, deliberately choosing to become something softer and stronger for it. What would you change? Everything eventually, Victoria said, but I have to start somewhere realistic. Real parental leave, on-site childcare at our major facilities, flexible scheduling for single parents that doesn't quietly punish them come promotion time the way it does now. Scholarship funds for employees' children. I want Sterling Logistics to be the kind of place where a widowed father with a daughter he loves more than anything doesn't have to choose between being present for her and keeping his job. Nathan felt his throat tighten. You're talking about building this because of us. I'm talking about building this because meeting you taught me that the metrics I spent my whole life optimizing for were the wrong metrics, Victoria said simply. You never once tried to impress me, Nathan. You never chased status or leverage or anything I could give you. You just showed up honestly every single time, and it turns out that was worth more to me than every acquisition I've ever closed. I'd like to build a company that understands that. Not because it's good PR, because I actually believe it now. Lily's bike wobbled slightly as she took the turn around the oak tree too fast, and she called out unbothered, I meant to do that, before straightening and continuing her loop. And both adults on the porch laughed the specific easy laugh of people who had survived something hard together, and found on the other side of it something worth all the cost. I love you, Nathan said quietly, almost like he was testing the words for the first time out loud, though he'd been feeling them for weeks. I don't think I've said that yet. I should have said it sooner. Victoria turned to look at him, and whatever she saw in his face made her eyes go bright and wet in the late afternoon light. I love you too. I think I've loved you since the gymnasium, honestly. Since I watched you crouch down to defend your daughter's dinosaur classification skills like it was the most important negotiation of the year. It was Triceratops, Nathan said, his voice thick. Still is, for the record. Duly noted, Victoria said, and leaned over to kiss him slow and unhurried, while Lily rode her bike in wide, happy circles and pretended with the diplomatic tact only children can manage not to notice. The SEC investigation into Richard Callahan concluded 3 months later, well outside the frantic news cycle that had once consumed both their lives, in the quiet, unglamorous way most white-collar investigations conclude a settlement, a substantial fine, an agreement barring him from serving on the board of any publicly traded company for a period of 10 years. It wasn't the dramatic public reckoning some might have wanted for a man who'd hired a photographer to surveil a child, but Victoria found when the news came through that she didn't need drama. She needed it to be over, and it was. Diane brought her the settlement paperwork on a quiet Tuesday morning, setting it on her desk with none of the urgency that had defined their interactions 4 months earlier. It's done, officially done. He's out permanently, and the fine is substantial enough that I doubt he'll be trying anything like this again anytime soon." Victoria looked at the paperwork for a long moment, then set it aside without much ceremony. "Good. File it. I don't need to look at his name again if I can help it. How are you feeling?" Victoria considered the question honestly, the way she'd learned to consider most questions since Nathan walked into her life. "Lighter," she said finally. "Like I put down something I'd been carrying so long I forgot it was heavy." Diane smiled the particular warm smile of a woman who'd watched her boss transform slowly and unmistakably over the past several months into someone she barely recognized from the exhausted, hollow-eyed woman who'd stood staring at a phone number at 1 in the morning. "You seem happy, Victoria. I don't think I've ever actually seen you happy before, not like this." "I don't think I've ever actually been happy before," Victoria admitted. "Not like this." That evening, she drove to Nathan's house without calling ahead, something she'd started doing more often in recent weeks. The careful choreography of their early relationship gradually giving way to something more natural, more assumed, the quiet confidence of two people who no longer needed advance notice to feel welcome in each other's lives. She found Nathan in the kitchen, flour dusted across the counter and somehow across one side of his face, Lily standing on a step stool beside him with a wooden spoon in one hand and an expression of intense concentration. "We're making cookies," Lily announced before Victoria had even fully gotten through the door. "Daddy says I can lick the spoon, but only after we bake them, which doesn't make any sense because the dough is the best part." "Salmonella," Nathan said without looking up from the mixing bowl. "We've discussed this." "I don't even know what that is." "Exactly the point." Victoria laughed and crossed the kitchen, kissing Nathan's flour-dusted cheek and ruffling Lily's hair, and something about the domestic ordinariness of it, the smell of vanilla and butter, the specific chaos of a kitchen. Mid-baking project, Nathan's easy affection. Lily's endless negotiation struck Victoria, as it often did lately, as more valuable than anything she'd ever purchased with the wealth she'd spent a lifetime accumulating. "Good day," Nathan asked, glancing at her over Lily's head. "Richard's settlement is finalized. It's officially completely over." Nathan set down the mixing spoon and pulled her into a hug, flour and all, not caring that it transferred a fine white dust onto her blazer. "It's over," he repeated quietly into her hair. "God, Victoria, it's actually over." "It's over," she confirmed, and felt saying it like the words themselves carried weight, like speaking them into the kitchen made them finally real. Lily, watching this embrace with the frank curiosity of a child, assessing an important development, tugged on Victoria's sleeve until she pulled back enough to look down at her. "Does this mean the bad stuff is all done? No more reporters and no more mean board guy and no more kids at school being weird?" Victoria crouched down to Lily's eye level, the way she'd learned to do in that gymnasium months earlier. A gesture that had become as natural to her now as any boardroom posture she'd spent decades perfecting. "The bad man is gone for good," she said, "and I think most of the reporters have found other people to bother by now. As for kids being weird at school, I wish I could promise that part's completely done, sweetheart. Kids are sometimes weird about things they don't understand, even when the grown-ups fix the actual problem. But I promise you this, whatever happens, your dad and I are always going to be right here, and nothing anyone says is going to change how much we love you." Lily considered this with the seriousness she brought to most important pronouncements, then nodded, apparently satisfied. "Okay, can I lick the spoon now?" "After they bake," Nathan said again firmly, and Lily groaned with the theatrical despair of a child denied a fundamental right, and the kitchen filled with laughter, and Victoria thought, watching the two of them bicker affectionately about cookie dough safety protocols, that she had never in her entire life felt more completely unambiguously home. It was Franklin Ostro, unexpectedly, who gave voice to what the whole ordeal had ultimately clarified for Victoria at a smaller, quieter board meeting held 2 weeks after Richard's settlement was finalized, called specifically to review the new employee welfare initiatives Victoria had spent the intervening months developing. "I want to say something before we get into the specifics," Franklin said, looking around the table at the reconstituted board, Two new members had replaced Richard and one of his allies who'd resigned quietly, rather than face further scrutiny. Both women, Victoria had specifically recruited for their backgrounds in labor relations and corporate ethics. "I've sat on this board for 18 years. I watched your father build this company, Victoria, and I respected him enormously. But I'll say this now that he's not here to hear it. He built a company that ran on fear and efficiency, and it made us all a great deal of money. And it also made this place frankly a little bit soulless." What's happened these past few months? Everything with Richard, everything with your situation, it's forced something out into the open that probably should have come out years ago. I think what you're proposing here. He tapped the folder in front of him, containing the parental leave expansions, the childcare initiatives, the scholarship programs, is the first time in 18 years I've felt genuinely proud to be associated with this company, rather than just well compensated by it. Victoria felt something tighten in her throat unexpected, and had to take a moment before responding. "Thank you, Franklin. That means more than you probably realize." "I mean it," he said. "Your father built an empire. I think you might actually be building something worth having." The initiatives passed unanimously. The new parental leave policy extending paid time for both primary and secondary caregivers well beyond industry standard. The on-site childcare pilot program at the 3 largest distribution facilities. The scholarship fund named at Victoria's specific insistence. And over the mild embarrassment of the man, it honored the Brooks Family Educational Trust established for the children of Sterling Logistics employees, who'd lost a parent, a detail Nathan hadn't learned about until Victoria told him that evening, and which left him too moved to speak for nearly a full minute. "You didn't have to name it after us," he finally managed. "I wanted to," Victoria said. "I wanted something good to come out of all of it. Something that outlasts Richard, outlasts the tabloids, outlasts every ugly thing that tried to tear us apart these past few months. I wanted there to be some permanent proof that what almost destroyed us actually built something better instead." Nathan pulled her close, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything at all, standing together in the small living room with Kate's photograph watching from the side table, the ghost of one love making silent, generous room for the arrival of another. Exactly the way Nathan had once told Victoria, love actually worked. Not a pie with only so many slices to go around, but something that simply grew to fit whoever walked into the room and stayed. "Lily's going to want to say in how the scholarship money gets used. You know?" Nathan said, eventually a smile breaking through his emotion. "She's already informed me she thinks hamster-related science projects should qualify for special funding. I'll add it to the board's next agenda," Victoria said, laughing through her own tears now, and the sound of it filled the small house, completely chasing out whatever shadows the last several months had left behind, leaving room finally for something that felt unmistakably permanently like family. Spring arrived quietly that year, the way it does after a long winter. Nobody quite remembers surviving, until suddenly the surviving is over, and the sun is just there again, warmer than expected, asking nothing of anyone. Victoria stood at the window of her office on a Thursday morning in April, watching the trucks roll out of the downtown distribution hub below the Sterling Logistics logo, catching the early light on 40 identical trailers pulling onto the interstate in careful, choreographed succession. And found herself thinking, as she often did now, about how strange it was that the same view could look so different depending on who was standing at it. 8 months earlier, that view had belonged to a woman who measured her worth in tonnage moved and margins protected, a woman who came to this window at midnight because there was nowhere else worth being. Now it belonged to someone who checked her watch, not because a call was overdue, but because Lily's spring choir concert started at 4, and Victoria had promised with the same solemnity she once reserved for shareholder commitments that she would not be late. Diane knocked once and let herself in without waiting for an answer. A habit she'd earned over 12 years of service and countless crises weathered together. The Hendricks people signed. Final terms, no changes. Marcus is thrilled. Wants to take you to dinner to celebrate. Tell him I have a choir concert. Diane smiled the particular warm smile that had become a fixture of her face over the past several months. I already told him that actually before you even said it. I've learned to anticipate. You've become entirely too good at your job." "I've had excellent material to work with," Diane said. "You're a different person than you were a year ago, Victoria. I hope you know that. I hope you feel it, not just hear people tell you." Victoria turned from the window, considering the question with the same care she now brought to most things that mattered. "I feel it every single day," she said. "It's strange. I used to think being strong meant needing nothing. Now I think it means being brave enough to need something and showing up for it anyway, even when it's terrifying. Nathan taught me that without ever meaning to teach me anything. He just lived it every day in front of me until I finally understood." "Well," Diane said, gathering her folder, "whatever he did, it worked. Go to your choir concert. I'll hold down the fort." Nathan had returned to his job at the insurance company 8 months ago now, and something in the rhythm of that return had surprised him. Not the job itself, which remained exactly as unglamorous and necessary as it had always been, but the way his relationship to it had shifted quietly, without any dramatic turning point he could point to. He no longer felt the way he once had in the exhausted years right after Kate's death, like his job was simply the mechanism that kept the roof over Lily's head and food on the table. A means to an end he rarely examined too closely, because examining it too closely felt dangerous, like pulling on a thread that might unravel the fragile stability he'd built. Now he found something almost like satisfaction in the daily rhythm of it, reviewing claims, carefully advocating for policyholders who'd been shortchanged by adjusters looking to close files quickly, rather than fairly mentoring 2 younger employees who'd sought him out. Specifically, they told him because they'd heard he was the kind of person who did the job right, even when nobody was watching. He'd been offered a promotion in February, regional claims manager, a title with more money attached to it and considerably more hours, and had turned it down without much internal debate. A decision that would have been unthinkable to him a year earlier, when every dollar mattered in ways that shaped every choice. "You could have taken that job," Victoria said to him one evening, not with any judgment in it, just genuine curiosity. The two of them sitting on his porch while Lily did homework at the kitchen table inside, close enough that they could hear her occasionally muttering complaints about long division through the screen door. "I could have," Nathan agreed. "The money would have been nice, but it meant travel longer hours, less time for pickup and drop-off and dinner and homework. I spent 2 years after Kate died, terrified that if I wasn't perfectly present for Lily every single moment, I'd somehow fail her the way I couldn't stop failing to save her mother. I'm past that fear now mostly, but I'm not past knowing what actually matters. The promotion wasn't going to make me happier. It was just going to make me busier." Victoria reached over and took his hand, calloused in a way none of the hands in her previous life had ever been, and found, as she often did, that she preferred it that way. "I used to think ambition and contentment were the same thing," she said. "I've learned they're not even related most of the time. I spent 20 years chasing the first one and it never once produced the second. And now I have both," Victoria said, "for the first time in my life, and it turns out contentment was never about having more. It was about having the right things." The choir concert that afternoon took place in the same gymnasium where Lily had once played a shaky, triumphant Für Elise nearly a year earlier, though the folding chairs had been rearranged and the sheet cake on the refreshment table now read, "Congratulations, singers," instead of "Great job, musicians." Small differences that struck Victoria sitting in the 3rd row this time, rather than hiding in the back as evidence of just how far they'd all traveled since that recital. She no longer needed to hide. That was the thing that struck her most, watching Nathan settle into the seat beside her, his arm slung easily across the back of her chair. Neither of them flinching at the parents who glanced their way. Some out of simple curiosity, most with nothing more than the mild, unbothered recognition reserved for any 2 parents attending their child's school event. The story that had once consumed headlines and threatened to end both their lives as they knew them had, in the natural way of most news cycles, simply faded, replaced by newer scandals, newer outrages, newer photographs of newer people. Until Victoria Sterling and Nathan Brooks had become in the collective public memory little more than a footnote. The billionaire who fell for the ordinary man. The corporate villain who got what he deserved. A story with a tidy ending that people vaguely remembered and had mostly stopped thinking about. Lily walked out with her class third row from the front, scanning the audience the way children always do, until she found the faces she was looking for. And when she spotted Nathan and Victoria together, she gave them a small private wave that she clearly hoped her classmates wouldn't notice. And Victoria felt something in her chest swell so large it was almost uncomfortable. The choir sang 3 songs off-key, in the specific endearing way elementary school choirs are always off-key. Lily's voice occasionally rising slightly too enthusiastically above the others during the parts she apparently liked best. And Victoria found herself once again clapping harder than anyone else in the row. "You really do clap, like you're putting out a fire," Nathan murmured, leaning close. "Someone told me that once," Victoria said. "I decided I liked it too much to stop." After the concert in the crowded cake-smelling chaos of the gymnasium, Lily found them immediately pigtails slightly askew from an afternoon of singing with enthusiasm rather than precision, and threw her arms around Victoria's waist with the easy, unguarded affection that had become entirely natural between them over the past year. "Did you hear me? I sang the loud part extra loud." "I heard you specifically," Victoria said. "I could pick your voice out of the whole choir." "Really? Really? You have a very distinctive loud part." Lily beamed, accepting this as the highest possible compliment, and then holding one of Victoria's hands and one of Nathan's, swinging slightly between them, the way children do when they're happy and don't quite know what to do with the extra energy of it. She asked the question that would end up, though none of them knew it yet, marking the true close of everything that had started at a gala nearly a year before. "Does this mean you're coming home with us for dinner?" It was such a small question, ordinary in every way. An 8-year-old's questions tend to be ordinary, but Victoria felt the full weight of everything it actually meant land on her at once. Not just an invitation to dinner, but an invitation into a life. An acknowledgement spoken with the effortless honesty only children manage that Victoria had stopped being a visitor in their world sometime in the past year, and had simply, without any formal ceremony, become part of it. "For as long as you'll have me," Victoria said, and meant it as completely as she had ever meant anything in her life. Nathan looked at the 2 people he loved most in the world, standing in a school gymnasium that still smelled faintly of sheet cake and floor wax, and felt something settle in his chest that he recognized with something like wonder as peace. Not the temporary peace of a good day, but something deeper and more permanent. The particular peace of a man who had once believed he'd spent his one great love and had discovered against every reasonable expectation that love simply made room for more when the right person walked through the door and refused to leave. He realized, watching Victoria crouch down to hear the rest of Lily's excited recap of the concert, that the billionaire hadn't saved his life the way the tabloids had once tried to frame it, hadn't swept in with money and rescued the way stories like theirs were so often told. She'd simply reminded him of something he'd known once, a long time ago, before grief had made him forget it. That kindness, honesty, and the people who choose to stay, even when staying, costs them something, were the only riches that had ever actually mattered. The following autumn, exactly 14 months after the night Victoria first crossed a crowded ballroom because a stranger's smile had caught her attention, Sterling Logistics announced its new Family Sustainability Initiative at a press conference that looked nothing like the chaotic media circus that had once surrounded the company's name. Victoria stood at a podium in the same building where she'd once faced down Richard Callahan, flanked not by lawyers and crisis communications specialists, but by 2 employees whose lives had been directly changed by the new policies, a single mother from the Ohio distribution center who'd used the on-site childcare program to keep her job after her previous arrangement fell through, and a father from the Texas hub who'd taken advantage of the expanded parental leave after his wife's difficult pregnancy, standing there now with a healthy 6-month-old strapped to his chest, gurgling occasionally into the microphone feed in a way that made even the assembled reporters smile. A year ago, Victoria told the room, I learned in the most painful and public way possible that the life I'd built was missing something essential. I want to be honest with you about what that was because I think honesty is the only thing worth building a company's reputation on. I learned that I had spent 20 years optimizing for metrics that made my father proud and made our shareholders wealthy. And in the process, I had built something that had very little room in it for the actual lives of the people who made it run. I met someone who reminded me that the measure of a life isn't what you accumulate. It's who's waiting for you to come home, and whether you've built a world that makes room for that kind of waiting to exist for everyone, not just the people at the top of an org chart. She glanced briefly toward the back of the room, where Nathan stood with Lily. Both of them there at Victoria's specific invitation. Both of them watching with a quiet pride that had nothing to do with cameras or headlines. And everything to do with 4 people, if you counted Kate's memory as Nathan always did, who had somehow found their way to something whole. The programs we're announcing today, Victoria continued. Expanded childcare, guaranteed parental leave regardless of gender or role, flexible scheduling protections, and the Brooks Family Educational Trust for the children of employees who've lost a parent. These aren't public relations exercises. They're an apology in the most concrete form I know how to offer for 20 years of a company culture that asked its employees to choose between their livelihoods and their families and called that choice normal. It was never normal. It was just what we'd all agreed to accept. I don't accept it anymore. The press conference generated headlines, of course, though considerably softer ones than the storm that had once threatened to end everything. Business journalists writing, measured mostly admiring pieces about corporate culture reform. A few skeptics noting the initiatives would cost the company millions in the short term, though even the skeptics grudgingly acknowledged the long-term retention numbers already trending in a direction that suggested the investment might pay for itself many times over. Franklin Ostro, watching from the second row, leaned over to Diane during the Q&A session and murmured loud enough that Diane later repeated it to Victoria with evident delight. Her father would have hated every word of this. I think that's exactly why it's right. That evening, the 4 of them, because it had become entirely natural over the past year to think of themselves as 4. Lily, always careful to include the framed photograph of her mother whenever the family did something worth remembering, propping it up on the counter or the coffee table. Like Kate deserved a seat at every important occasion, gathered at Nathan's house for a dinner that had none of the careful nervousness of that first spaghetti night over a year earlier. Lily, older now by 14 months and considerably more confident in her culinary opinions, had insisted on helping cook, which meant the kitchen counter was once again dusted in a fine layer of flour. Though this time, nobody minded, and Nathan had long since stopped pretending the mess bothered him. I want to make an announcement, Lily said with the particular gravity she reserved for pronouncements she'd clearly been planning for some time, standing on the same step stool she'd used the day they'd made cookies together, wooden spoon held aloft like a scepter. Go ahead, Nathan said, setting down the pan he was holding, exchanging an amused glance with Victoria. I've decided, Lily announced, that Victoria should move in. Officially. Not just staying over sometimes. All the time. Because it's silly that she drives home every night when her house has 14 rooms and nobody's in any of them, and our house only has 4 rooms and 3 of them have people in them who love her. The kitchen went quiet for a beat, Nathan and Victoria exchanging a look that carried an entire unspoken conversation. A conversation in truth they'd already been having privately for weeks, in the careful, deliberate way adults navigate decisions that matter too much to rush, neither of them quite ready to be the one who said it out loud first. Is that so? Nathan said slowly, a smile fighting its way across his face. That's so, Lily confirmed, entirely serious. I've thought about it a lot. I even made a list of reasons if you want to hear them. I would very much like to hear the list, Victoria said, doing her best to keep her voice steady, though something enormous was building behind her ribs. Lily set down the spoon and counted off on her fingers with the meticulous care of a lawyer presenting closing arguments. 1, you're already here basically every day anyway, so it's not even a big change. 2, Daddy smiles more when you're here, and I like that smile better than his regular smile. 3. You make really good pancakes, better than Daddy's. Don't tell him I said that. 4. She paused for dramatic effect. I already think of you as basically my other mom, even though you're not trying to replace my real mom because I know you can't replace someone, but you're like an extra one, and extra moms are good. Actually, I looked it up and lots of kids have step-parents, and it's fine. The kitchen went very still. Nathan's eyes had filled, and he made no attempt this time to hide it, and Victoria felt tears sliding down her own face freely, without any of the old instinct to apologize for them or explain them away. Lily. Nathan said, his voice thick. That might be the best speech I've ever heard. So can she move in? Nathan looked at Victoria, and in his eyes was a question that went considerably deeper than the logistics of moving boxes and changing addresses. A question about whether she was ready. Whether either of them was ready to make permanent what had started as two strangers talking at a gala. Neither of them had wanted to attend. I would like that more than almost anything, Victoria said, answering both Lily and Nathan at once, her voice unsteady with the particular joy that comes only after real fear has been survived. If your dad wants that too. I've wanted that for months, Nathan admitted, crossing the kitchen to take her hands. I just didn't know how to ask a woman who owns 14 rooms to trade them for 4. I'd trade 14 empty rooms for 4 full ones every single time, Victoria said. I already have. I think I traded them the night I called you the first time, and you were up to your elbows in blue and red dishwater. Best crime scene of my life, Nathan said, laughing through his tears now, and pulled her into a hug that Lily immediately gleefully insisted on joining, wrapping her arms around both of them, until the three of them stood together in the small, flour-dusted kitchen, laughing and crying in the particular tangled way families do when something has finally fully arrived. They were married the following spring in a ceremony deliberately small and deliberately unglamorous, held in the backyard beneath the same oak tree that had once held Lily's rope swing, and briefly a stranger's hidden camera. A detail Victoria insisted on over the objections of an event planner who couldn't understand why a woman with Victoria's resources wanted a 50-person backyard wedding instead of the kind of lavish affair the society pages would have devoured. I've had lavish, Victoria told the planner, with a patience that would have astonished the woman she'd been 2 years earlier. I want small. I want it to feel like us. Lily served as the flower girl, taking the role with a seriousness that bordered on the theatrical, scattering rose petals along the aisle with the focused precision of a surgeon, and stopping midway to make sure everyone had noticed her technique before continuing. Diane cried through the entire ceremony unabashedly in the front row, and Franklin Ostro gave a brief gruff toast at the small reception afterward that ended with him raising his glass and declaring to general laughter and a few surprised tears. To the CEO, who taught an old board that sentiment properly directed builds a stronger company than fear ever did. Nathan, standing beneath the oak tree, in a suit that fit him considerably better than the one he'd worn to that first gala, watched Victoria walk toward him across a backyard full of people who genuinely loved them both. No cameras, no headlines, no board members calculating leverage, and felt the full arc of the past 2 years settle into something he could finally call complete. You're the only person here who hasn't tried to impress me, he murmured when she reached him, echoing the words she'd said to him at that first gala so long ago. Now it sometimes felt like it belonged to different people entirely. I stopped trying to impress you a long time ago, Victoria said, smiling through happy tears. I decided just being honest with you worked a lot better. It did, Nathan said. It does. It's the best thing that's ever happened to me aside from her. He nodded toward Lily, who was currently attempting to convince Mrs. Alvarez, seated in the second row, that the flower petal technique she'd just demonstrated deserved some kind of formal recognition. Aside from her, Victoria agreed, and I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure both of you know exactly how much you're loved every single day, no matter what else is happening in the world. They exchanged vows that were simple and unrehearsed promises about showing up, about honesty over performance, about building a life measured in the small, unglamorous moments, spaghetti dinners and piano recitals and choir concerts and school pickups, rather than in the acquisitions and headlines that had once defined success for one of them and simple survival for the other. When the officiant finally pronounced them married, the small backyard erupted into applause. Lily clapping loudest of all, harder than anyone, exactly the way Victoria had once clapped for her at a recital in a gymnasium that smelled like sheet cake and possibility. Years from now, when people ask Lily Brooks about her childhood, and people do ask occasionally, because the story of the billionaire and the single father had, despite everyone's best efforts at privacy, become something of a quiet local legend, retold at dinner parties and school reunions, with the soft edges time gives to stories that end well. She tells them the truth, simply without embellishment. She tells them her father was the strongest person she ever knew, not because he was rich or famous or powerful, but because he got up every single day after losing the love of his life and made breakfast anyway, packed lunches anyway, showed up for every recital and every science fair and every ordinary Tuesday. Anyway, without once making her feel like his exhaustion was her burden to carry. She tells them that her other mother, because that's what she calls Victoria, now has called her that since she was 8 years old, and made a very serious list of reasons why an extra mom was a good thing, actually taught her that the biggest house in the world means nothing if there's nobody inside it waiting for you, and that the richest people aren't always the ones with the most money, but the ones who know exactly who they'd give everything up for. She tells them that her family was built not out of convenience or circumstance, but out of two people who chose each other deliberately, honestly. Even when choosing each other cost them nearly everything: a career, a reputation, a fragile peace. Neither of them had realized they still needed, and that watching them make that choice over and over in board meetings and kitchens and school gymnasiums, and finally beneath an oak tree on a spring afternoon, taught her more about what actually matters in this life than any lesson she ever learned in a classroom. And when people ask her, as they sometimes do, whether the story is really true, the billionaire, the insurance clerk, the photograph, the scandal, the fall of a powerful man who tried to destroy an ordinary family and lost, she simply smiles, the same soft, unguarded smile her father wore in a photograph on his phone the night this whole story began, and tells them, the truth is simpler and better than any version the tabloids ever printed. Money can buy influence, it can buy comfort and power, and the appearance of a life well lived. But it cannot buy the thing her father had all along. The thing Victoria Sterling had to lose everything to finally understand that genuine character, quiet and unglamorous, and utterly unconcerned with being noticed, is the only currency that has ever truly earned anyone a place at someone's table, a hand to hold through the hardest years, and a home worth coming back to every single night for the rest of a life. That in the end is the whole story, and it is without question completely permanently true.